Hello everyone, my name is Stanley St. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Now, before I go into summary analysis of this work, please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment so that the channel can continue to grow. Now, from the get-go of this narrative by Mary Rowlandson, we pretty much get a wonderful picture of her life and where she comes from. At this time in America, it really wasn't even America. You get, English people coming from England, people coming from Europe, coming to, America, or what we know as America today. Mary Rowlandson, she's this woman who's pretty much, she's had a wonderful life. She's married. We learned that she's married. We learned that she lives in a town by the name of Lancaster in Massachusetts. And her life is wonderful. She has a lot of kids. She's married to a minister, a preacher. It's a very religious life. She's a Puritan, and this is Puritan because we're talking about the colonies here. We're talking about in America that's very different from what we know today. The colonies, the people in the colonies, they had to pretty much live with American Indians, Native Americans. It's more proper to call them American Indians today, according to some sources. So, the Puritans, and specifically Rowlandson here, she's living in Lancaster, Massachusetts, and her town is not really that safe. She's had a great life throughout, her childhood and throughout her adulthood. She's married, she has a lot of kids, and she has a home, there's food, she has everything she needs to have a happy life according to that time. Now, the only problem that she's having is of course the Indians, because conflict is brewing between the settlers, between the Puritans, between the colonizers and the Indians, and within her narrative. For one thing, the Indians, the way that they lived in America is that there was no ownership of land, and that's something that's very different. When you look at the settlers and you look at the Indians, there was something that was very different from the parties, because the Indians, the way that they live is that everybody shared the land. Like the tribes, they shared the land. If you're gonna use this as farming land for this season, you plant your corn or whatever, and then next season somebody else could use it. So nobody just took a place and never shared it. The Indians just shared the land with each other. The way that Rowlandson describes the Indians in this work is that they're kind of like people who move around the land. They'll build wigwams. They'll have wonderful parties. They'll eat. They'll feast. They'll celebrate, and they'll move on and they'll build wigwams in other places. And just they lived off the land. It's almost like the way that she describes them in great detail. It's almost like the Indians were a part of the land, just like how the trees and rivers and the sky and the land was part of the land. The way that the Indians lived, it was like they were a part of the land. It wasn't like, they were a nation and the land belonged to them. It was like the nature is nature, animals are animals, trees are trees, and Indians are Indians. We're all one thing. But the settlers had did it a different way. The settlers, the party that, of course, Rowlandson was a part of, they build walls and fences and fortifications, and so they saw themselves as conquerors, as people who were coming in to take over the land and to subdue it and to be the masters of the land. And if you compare the way that the Indians live and the way that the settlers live, one lived free and off of the land, and one lived to conquer it and to master over the land. And so this caused the conflict because the settlers were pretty much just building fences and walls, and when the Indians would want to use that land, they couldn't. And when they would plant their crops in certain places, the settlers would rip it and just pretty much push them away and tell them they can't farm in certain places and that the land didn't belong to them. And so this caused conflict, and pretty much war broke out throughout throughout the colonies, basically, because the Indians were just being pushed out, and a lot of times they got fed up and they fought back. And so, I mean, when you think about the colonies, you usually think that, England came in, English settlers came in and just took over the land, but not really. It was really a struggle. Settlers were being killed left and right. Indian people were being killed left and right, and atrocities were committed on both sides. Because at first the Indians were like, okay, we can share it, and the settlers were like, yeah, of course we can share it, but of course that did not happen. They did not share it. So when the narrative begins, we see Rowlandson. She's pretty much telling us that her life is good. Her husband's away because the conflict it's brewing. It's getting worse, and pretty much her husband goes away to get help and to get more English settlers to come and help the town of Lancaster, Massachusetts, fend off the Indians, because war was on the horizon, and while he's away with a lot of other men from the town of Lancaster, the Indians attack, and pretty much a brutal scene takes place where the Indians come in and they're shooting and hacking settlers down, and bloodshed, and people die left and right, and it was a fierce battle, but the people of Lancaster, they were not prepared, and especially since some of the men were away, and already they didn't even have enough men to defend themselves, because of course that's why Rowlandson's husband went away. He wanted to go find help. So even if he was there, he most likely would have probably just died. He would have died probably, and yeah, so he's away. The Indians come in, they kill a bunch of people, and the way that Rowlandson describes the killing, it's brutal, it's bloody, it's nasty. It's pretty much people are hiding and crying, and wailing, and the Indians are just coming in and just taking over because they're fed up. And so Rowlandson, her and her baby daughter are taken into captivity with a bunch of other people, and pretty much for 3 months they're traveling America, they're backpacking across America, and pretty much Rowlandson and the people in captive, they become property, and the Indians pretty much sell them to each other. There's one person that was sold for a gun, and the Indians just treated them as property. And Rowlandson, her and her children, they all get separated. Her son, her daughter, her baby daughter that was in her arms, that baby just pretty much died because it got hurt. Rowlandson got hurt herself. She got injured throughout. When Lancaster gets attacked, Rowlandson gets hurt, and pretty much after she gets hurt, she's they take her. She's a captive along with her baby daughter, and going out through the cold and through the wilderness. And the Indians, the way that the one thing that's interesting about them, the way that they capture people, it's not like they put her in chains, and they command every one of her moves. It's just that you're ours now, you belong to us, and just follow us. Like, it's not like they were just dragging her around in chains. So we see them even try to be kind to her, because like when they see that her and her baby are suffering, they gave her a horse, but the horse had no saddle. It was like a bareback horse, and then she fell over the top of it, and they laughed at her. They weren't beating her or doing anything the way that she describes it, because this is her narrative. It's not like they were beating her or abusing her of any kind. That wasn't there. It's just that they didn't take care of her. They didn't feed her, or they didn't feel like it was their responsibility to feed her. Because one thing about this narrative is that it says the captivity, right? It says a narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson. Now, the thing is, when you look at the captivity part of this narrative, it's not the type of captivity you would think of. When you think of captivity, you're thinking about maybe slavery, you're thinking about people in chains, people in cells, people that are under bondage. And then, yes, she was under bondage. Yes, she was pretty much sold to a person down the line, an Indian individual down the line. But they weren't just like pushing her around about in chains. And the things like they weren't worried about her running away, because again, this is the wilderness. This is America during the time of colonization. I mean, it's all wilderness all around you. I mean, towns were being built left and right, but for the most part, America was just a massive wilderness. So even if she tried to run away, how is a woman with a baby in her arms going to survive in the wilderness, or even make it back to civilization and find an English settlement to be or to go to? So she had no choice but to stick with them. I mean, there's even one scene where her master pretty much tells her to get out of his wigwam, and she's pretty much like begging other Indians to help to allow her to stay in their wigwams, and a lot of them are like, no, we don't want you in here. Go find your own place to sleep. Go find your own food. So the Indians, the way that she describes them within this work, they're kind of like, they pillage, they kill, they take what's theirs, they live off the land, and they have massive parties, and they eat a lot. There are several points where she describes them as savages, as beasts, but at the same time, there are times where she describes them as human beings, as they're being nice to her, and helping her. Again, these were not abusive people. These were not. They weren't taking advantage of her of any kind. She was just known as property. So it's very fascinating, because we're seeing all of this through Rowlandson's point of view. Religion is used a lot in this narrative. Religion is used a lot because they give her a Bible. Throughout the pillaging and the war, they find a Bible. They give it to Rowlandson, and Rowlandson pretty much gets through this through God, and she pretty much uses the Bible for when she needs strength, when she needs solace, when she needs comfort, when she needs hope. She just opens up this Bible and look through it and find scripture that helps her get through it. And pretty much everything that goes, everything that she went through, she just finds a passage or a chapter to read and to strengthen herself. So when you read this narrative, or throughout the entire narrative, there's so many biblical references, in her comparing her circumstance through other figures in the Bible and through other verses and scripture in the Bible, and she becomes a better Christian for it. I guess that's one thing you can say that she believes that she gained from her experience of being a captive of the Indians, is that she got a closer connection to God, and she saw that when her life was happy, when her life was good, that was one thing, but when she lost it all, it was another thing. And she saw how horrible and difficult life can get, and how wonderful her life was before all of these things happened to her. And that says a lot about life, because a lot of times we don't know what we had until we lose it. So the Bible becomes a great source of strength for her, and her purity, her religion really helps her stay strong and not fall into depression and probably even kill herself, because it almost came to that, because her kids, keep in mind that her kids were taken from her and they were sold to different people in the tribes, different Indians, and her kids were spread apart. So she had to beg and sometimes even cry, beg and cry to go see her kids in these different places and in these different tribes. So slowly she does reunite with her kids, and slowly she figures out who's alive, who's dead. Again, her little baby girl, the girl dies, but her other kids, they stay strong, and she gets reunited with them later. So pretty much the way that she organizes this work, or the narrative, is there's 20 removes. She goes from the first remove to 20 removes, and pretty much each remove kind of have a different location, a different physical location, and she kind of like describes and tell us what happens, and pretty much how the Indians live. There's places where she's saying how much they're like savages. There's places where she's saying how they're kind, and also there are places where I can even say that she's kind of like saying how strong and brave they are, because she's seeing how when they lose their crops, or when the settlers burn their crops or ruin their reserves for the winter, she sees how they always manage to survive, and she's like they're very creative and very educated on the land and how to live on the land, because when they have no corn and no food to eat, what the people around her do, what the Indians do, they know what tree bark to eat. They eat frogs, they eat snakes, they know what animals to hunt and to eat and to survive on. And so in many ways, she's like, I don't know where they're getting the food from. Even though all of their crops are gone, they still manage to survive off the land. And you really don't even see the food until they're passing it to each other and they're eating. So even though in the dead of winter, there's no crops, there's nothing, the Indians still manage to eat and stay strong. And they're crafty enough to just find things to eat. Birds, frogs, snakes, tree bark, nuts, whatever they can find within the wilderness. They know how to hunt it. They know how to prepare it for themselves. And they just know how to eat and sleep and stay warm. So for that, she really says, man, these people are tougher than nails. We don't know what we're dealing with, because they're just very creative, very crafty. They just know how to survive. And so, she stays with them for 3 months. She's a captive for 3 months. Then pretty much through several Bible scriptures, and we go through the logistics of her, of the workings being put in place for her to be freed. Her husband gets news that she's alive, and other settlers chip in here and there, and she kind of just gives it all up to God, and kind of saying, God is working on my behalf, and people are chipping in money here and there, and eventually, there's a ransom, and she gets sold to her husband, or she gets bought from the Indians, and she goes and finds her husband, and she's reunited to her husband, and then later they buy their children back, and other people help them buy their children back. And she pretty much gives it all, she says God is doing all of this, because her husband is a minister, is a preacher. So they put their faith in God, and other people come in and help them, and they whatever money they have, they put it together, and they buy their children back, and life in of a way goes back to somewhat normal. Well, I guess it will never be normal, because the children in Rowlandson, they'll always be traumatized by what they saw, because they not only saw their friends and family members get killed when Lancaster was attacked. They had to live with the Indians for 3 months as captives, and although there's no account within this narrative of them being abused or beaten or anything like that, to have your family members killed in front of you, or your family killed in front of you, your house and everything being burned in front of you, and then to become somebody's property, it's never something that you just brush off and go living your normal life. So Rowlandson goes through all this, and in the end, she gives it all to God, and she's kind of saying now, I'm not going to, I'm not going to whine, or I'm not going to make any big deals out of little trivial matters in my life, because I saw what God took from me, or I had everything in Lancaster, my life was perfect. The Indians come in, they broke everything down, they burned everything down, they killed a bunch of people I loved or knew, and then God, even though I was scattered in the wind, my children were scattered in the wind, and I had nothing, and I thought I was going to die. Again, this woman was pretty much brought to the brink of almost committing suicide. She thought about it. She didn't do it, but it's something that popped in her mind because to her, to this Christian Puritan woman, seeing everyone die in front of you and your kids being separated from you and being told that you're now property, it's something that kind of like drove her to this darkness. But she finds strength in religion. She finds strength in the Bible that they gave to her, and she gives it all up, like, saying that God brought her back together. And I guess in the end we get a good ending. We get a happy ending because her and her husband end up back together, and her children and back in her arms. But I guess it's not all sweet because her baby daughter died in this whole situation. So that's the narrative. That's what happens to her. In terms of analysis, in terms of deeper meaning here, you have to look at the religion or the Puritan point of view that is used in this work. Pretty much everything that happens in your life to the Puritans, to Mary, to Rowlandson, is all in the work of God. She had everything, she lost everything, she got most of it back, and she pretty much says that it's God that made it all happen. She says that pretty much, I'm now closer to God because He delivered me from my captives. He delivered me from the savages, and now I'm free again. And then again, this is kind of like one of the earliest writings in American. Well, I guess you can't really say American literature, but I guess you can say early American literature, because a lot of writers and authors and people that come after Rowlandson, they really draw from the Bible. That's why any book or novel that you read from people like Hawthorne or any famous writers, American writers, they all, I have to say, they all kind of like draw from the Bible, or there are some things that they draw from the Bible. Melville, Hawthorne. I guess you can even put Mark Twain in there. You can throw so many authors. Orwell. These people, they kind of like, they lived in America that was different from our modern day because people read. I'm not saying there were Puritans or they existed in the time of the Puritans. It's just that until America entered the 21st century, religion was a massive part of American life. Even in the 20th century. The 21st century is the first century that Americans are starting to pull away from religion, or the deep and strict form of Christianity that existed for hundreds of years in America. There's a lot of things that Christians follow today, a lot of things that Christians do today that they wouldn't do in like 1920, right? The country was much more religious in 1920 than it is in 2021. So a lot of famous authors, a lot of famous writers, they use specific scripture and specific passages from the Bible to write, to make their point, or to look at life, or to write their narratives. And Rowlandson, she uses so many passages and verses in scripture within this work that it's pretty much, it's just a massive, like, it's almost like she was copying and pasting Bible verses into this narrative, because it's just all over the place. And even I would even go as far to say that the whole narrative could be like a Christian example story, because there's so much references to God and to the Bible and to what it means to her. Because again, she's a Puritan. That's her worldview. That's how she sees the world. Um, the other thing that I think that's significant in terms of analysis is the way that the Indians are depicted here. The American Indians, at first, Rowlandson just looks at them as savages, but at the same time, I would have to say that the imagery that she uses is very significant. I think the way that she describes them as these strong and powerful individuals, and they're crafty and intelligent. And um, I mean, if it wasn't for disease and sickness when the colonizers came to America and the settlers came to America, America would look very different today, because the Indians, I mean, after the colonizers had been here, and they got used to them, the Indians learned how to ride horses. They learned how to use guns. They learned how to communicate with the settlers. If it wasn't for disease, I mean, the bloodshed and the wars and the battles for America, they would have lasted for centuries. I think probably today, if it wasn't for disease and yeah, honestly, if it wasn't for disease, there's certain states that might not be part of the U.S. They might just be a part of like an Indian nation that could have existed if it wasn't for disease. Because I think that at some point in American history, if it wasn't for sickness and disease and you know, the things that the germs that the settlers were bringing to the Americas that the Indians weren't used to, if it wasn't for that, I think at some point the Indians would have united, and it would have been an all-out war, an all-out war. And I would say America would have been split down the middle, and you would have an American nation and an Indian nation, because there were a lot of them, you know, and they were being trained on the art of war and the art of and on survival, because they were using. I mean, they even knew how to use the currency of the settlers, because there throughout the work of Rowlandson here, we're seeing the Indians trading, buying and selling with the settlers, and going to you know, English towns and into places and parts of the country that are colonized, and they're buying and selling, and they're interacting with settlers, and so they were being educated, and they were being integrated into how the settlers lived. So if it wasn't for disease, I mean, you might have had an entirely different outcome into what America would be today. So that's very significant. The last thing I'll say is pretty much just how Rowlandson, you know, the way in which she faces this whole endeavor. I think the way that she sees it, I mean, it's a kind of strength that comes out of this woman to survive and to exist with the Indians that you wouldn't see out of other people, because, I mean, in several points throughout the work, you just see her kind of like find the strength, and of course she says it's from God, and of course she draws it from the Bible, but most people would have escaped and probably have died, but she remains strong. And I mean, she even becomes, I would say, there are two types of people in the world, right? There are people, when they meet times of hardship, they crumble and pass away and die. And there are other people that adapt. Rowlandson adapt, because it even came to the point where she started trading and selling with the Indians and started fending for herself. So this little woman, this housewife, this Bible-loving, Bible-reading woman really becomes an independent, strong individual that's literally debating and arguing with her captors, and later even begins to trade with them while she's a captive to survive. So, you know, she really didn't crumble, and we saw other women that were taken captives like her crumble within this work, but she remained strong, and she survives and her children survive, and then she ends up writing this narrative when it was all over. So her character is very interesting. And of course, this is, this is a real story. This is her life, and this actually happened. So I think that's very fascinating. So that's all I have to say about this work, about the narrative of Rowlandson and the significance of it. For me, the last thing I'll say is just that it really gave you a different picture of the battle for America, the early battle from America between the Indians and the settlers, and it really wasn't something that was cut and dry like the settlers. Like usually in a history class, you pretty much just get that the settlers came in, they were smarter, stronger, they had guns, they had horses, and they just took everything. It really wasn't like that. It was more that, it was just a struggle and fight for power. And again, I strongly believe if it wasn't for disease and germs and viruses, America would look very different. Because the Indians, they were getting very strong, and they knew the land better than the settlers. And the way that they fought was not normal, and these people, they can survive off the land. So if America, or if early America went to war with the Indians and there was no disease of any kind, and the Indians could just survive in the dead of winter without any crops, the settlers would be in trouble, because the Indians could just burn all the crops and go to battle, and just they'll know how to survive, because they'll eat snakes and birds and frogs and tree bark, and they'll be just fine. But the settlers, they were used to farming in the luxuries that farming brings. So yeah, the results might have been really different. But that's all I have to say. Please remember to leave a like, subscribe, and or comment, and I'll see you guys in my next video.